All right, welcome to Module 3. In this module, we're going to talk about different aspects of daily life mastery. So managing the real world challenges of our blood sugar management and strategies for doing so. In this first lesson, we're going to talk about eating well without stress or with minimal stress. Nutrition is absolutely a foundation for any pregnancy and especially for a type 1 pregnancy. So carb counting accuracy becomes especially critical, particularly in the second and third trimesters. So what we mean by this is that outside of pregnancy, you can have approximately, a 10-gram discrepancy, a tolerance in your blood sugars to manage if you were off counting by more or less than 10 grams. But that gets tighter, and we can manage only about 5 grams of discrepancy above or below what we had bolus for in terms of having good blood sugar outcomes. So our dosing might also be changing, and it's very likely to change, particularly around protein and fat, and especially if that's consumed in larger quantities. So it's very common outside of pregnancy to need to administer insulin to dose for higher protein meals. And this is considered to be a meal in which the protein exceeds 20 grams. And that would likely require that you dose at 20 to 30% of total protein. So for example, if you had a meal that had a really large chicken breast, and that was around 30 grams of protein, you would dose for about 10 grams. So the other aspect of this is that high protein, high fat meals can delay your peak glucose effect by 1 to 2 hours. And here you see, and can cause delayed gastric emptying, which extends the glucose curve. Circling back to the way that our digestion is affected by pregnancy is that this is exacerbated. So ideally, if you have a pump that allows you to give an extended or a dual wave bolus, you'd be delaying the portion of that bolus for the 10 grams of protein by as much as 30 to 60 minutes. And that would help account for the delay in the gastric emptying, as well as the delay in the onset of that protein functioning as a carb. So you're going to, in general, you're going to be looking to administer your bolus 10 to 20 minutes before your meal. This gets a little bit complicated, again, depending on what your pre-meal blood sugar is, as well as what you're going to be consuming. But in general, because it takes time, so for a non-diabetic, the reason that diabetics pre-bolus is because for someone who is not diabetic, their mind simply thinking about eating is beginning to generate the release of insulin from their pancreas. Since we are not doing that internally, we have to do it externally. And the 10 to 20 minutes is going to vary throughout your pregnancy. So 10 minutes of pre-bolusing in your first trimester will likely not be sufficient in third trimester when you've hit peak insulin resistance. So you can expect that you would need to bolus as many as 20, even 30 minutes prior to your meal, particularly if you are above that 95 milligrams per deciliter pre-meal blood sugar, and if you are having a higher carb meal. So for me, I'm often looking at, 15 to 20 minutes now that I'm in the later second trimester. And I often am considering, okay, am I having mostly protein and vegetables for supper? If that's the case, it might be as little as 10 minutes. So this is sort of a general guideline, and it is intensified in pregnancy. Again, we're dialing up the precision, and we're paying more attention to what our trends are. Something that I love to do in general is to incorporate protein, fiber, and fat in every meal and snack, because it improves satiety, but it also really affects the glucose spike. So by including fiber, by including protein, and by including fat, your carbs will be less intense in terms of the immediate spike in blood sugars that you see. You'll see a more gradual curve, things like that. Okay. Morning sickness. I have had pretty severe morning sickness with 2 of my 4 pregnancies, but know other women who've had it much worse than I have. And I think this is going to apply, especially if you are someone who is experiencing severe morning sickness. This the 15-15 rule is just essentially to attempt 15 grams of carbs every 15 minutes until food stays down. This might be something that you use even if you're just sick outside of pregnancy, and is less of a, you know, a novel idea. But the strategy that I think that it can be helpful with it is a mini bolus. So although you would normally want to try to pre-bolus, if you're having a hard time keeping your meal down and then having subsequent lows as a result, giving about 25% of that bolus when you start to eat, and then 25% every 15 minutes if you're keeping your food down, can reduce the likelihood that you're going to have extreme lows after you've just started to eat and now you're having a hard time eating, and you've set off, you've got this domino effect that's been put into play. Carb counting evolution during pregnancy. Again, we have to be tighter. We've got to know our glucose, or know our grams of carbs, more intensely during pregnancy. We don't have as much of a margin of error, because we'll see a 20 to 30 point glucose variation. And the other factor there is that food labels are often less than accurate. The FDA allows up to a 20% variation. And if you're having a hard time with, say, a good example might be a protein bar or something, right? Like that has an individual label. If that is causing you a lot of problems, you might wonder too about whether or not their labeling is good. If everything else that you're consuming is going well, you could consider that the label is not accurate. Jumping back, you're especially going to see this tight requirement in the third trimester. You likely will still have a greater margin of error in the first trimester. So meal timing, pre-bolus, again, we're looking at a standard in the first trimester. Here I have got 15 to 20, but I think 10 could be sufficient depending on what you're eating. And you see the 20 to 25 minutes in the second trimester, and then as much as 25 to 30. And what I mean by split dosing is if you're having an extended meal, like say you're coming up on the holidays, or if you're having that higher protein meal, you could split when you're administering the dose, depending on how much protein, how much fat, etc. A note on a strategy that I like to use is maximizing timers. It can be a lot to manage remembering to pre-bolus, and remembering to pre-bolus with enough time, remembering to pre-bolus and be the one who's making the meal. It can just be a lot. So something that has been helpful to me is to use the recipe as a cue. If I am starting cooking meat, unless it's going in a crock pot, that is usually a cue. If I'm putting something in the oven, or even, if I'm sauteing vegetables, those are little cues like, all right, I know that I'm going to be doing this for 10 to 15 minutes, maybe even as much as 20. So this would be a good time to either pre-bolus now, depending on where my blood sugar is, or if I'm putting something in the oven and the meal is going in the oven for 60 minutes, then I'm going to set my timer for 40 minutes to remind me to pre-bolus at the appropriate time. What about situations where you don't get to have that much advance warning, or you don't have a clear idea? I'm thinking about being at the restaurant or in the holidays when you don't know exactly what time the firm meal is, or you're not hosting or something like that. If you're going over to a friend's place for dinner, if you're not able to give your insulin in advance, something that in and of itself can be really helpful is simply to start with your vegetables and your protein. So give your insulin ASAP, but then just start with the things that don't have carbs. I know that it can be really frustrating to have to do that, and it's probably a really obvious one. But I think it can be helpful just to say, okay, I don't have to eat cold food in 20 minutes. I can start here and work my way through. And it's a good balance between, being really disappointed about a cold meal and also still managing your blood sugars. Okay. Again, key takeaway: we're looking at really strategic pre-bolusing. We're looking at some flexible strategies for managing morning sickness, and we're focusing on protein, fiber, and fat for better glucose control. Something that I want to note here, because I don't think that we covered this, and it can be really helpful as in terms of treating low blood sugars, is the connection that exists between your correction factor and your sensitivity factor. So if your correction factor is 1 unit per 10 grams, then and your sensitivity factor is, let's just say, 1 unit per 40 milligrams per deciliter, then 10 grams of insulin, 10 grams of carb will raise your blood sugar by approximately 40 points. And that relationship is really helpful, because as we become more resistant over the course of our pregnancy, we are going to need fewer grams of carbohydrate to treat a low blood sugar. It also may mean, because of our delayed absorption, that we have to wait longer for that same amount of glucose to have its effect on our low blood sugar. So, for example, if I am 50, if my blood sugar is 50, and I have the correction factor and the sensitivity factor, sorry, the carb ratio and the correction factor that I just outlined, 1 unit per 10 grams of carbs, and 1 unit per 40 grams milligrams per deciliter, and my blood sugar is 50, and I want to get my blood sugar to 90, to a comfortable range, then consuming 10 grams of insulin will raise my blood sugar to that about 90. Now, you can consider this too for exercise. For example, say you want to go for a 20-minute walk and you're starting at 90. Then you could have 10 grams of carbs before you go, in order to bump up your blood sugar before you go engage in some type of cardio activity. Again, this is impacted. So if you get down to 1 unit per 7 grams, 1 unit per 5.5 grams, which I think was where I ended my last pregnancy. And typically, just for reference, I'm often at 1 unit per 10 to 1 unit per 12 later in the day. And at the end of my third trimester in my third pregnancy, I think I was at 1 unit per 5.5 grams. That means that 5.5 grams could raise my blood sugar by my sensitivity factor in late pregnancy, which was 1 unit per 20 grams or 20 milligrams per deciliter. So again, I'll include these. These will be downloads that you can have as like quick calculations. But I really want to call your attention to that, because as we're talking about carb counting precision, those grams are equally important in terms of managing lows as they are in managing highs. Okay, now we've wrapped up for this lesson.